to make decisions. Failure to do this properly, to get this right, leads to communities feeling ignored or ill-informed and confused. The COVID-19 pandemic, like many crises that we experience and as people, as communities, has demonstrated the importance of promoting strong and healthy information ecosystems. As we're going to hear on the report, amidst the crisis, we witnessed an erosion of trust in scientific information, more broadly in health and government agencies and other groups, as information competed in the space of misinformation with other sources and people grappled to find the information that they needed. Today, we're exploring the role of better collaboration between media and health and humanitarian actors in increasing the effectiveness of this. We'll hear that media actors had challenges in accessing the information that they needed to communicate effectively. And we'll also hear that health and humanitarian actors were not always successful in transmitting complex scientific information in a way that journalists were able to use. The recommendations that are included in the report and will be discussed in more detail today seek to bridge the gap between these different actors for future public health emergencies. So in terms of the format of our discussion today, we're going to be hearing from some of the authors for more detail on the key findings of the report, as well as some of the recommendations. And then we'll be inviting more people for the discussion more broadly, and we'll try to leave some time at the end of the discussion today for questions and answers to our speakers. Some housekeeping before, as we move on, videos and mics off, if that is possible. And please do, I see people are chatting already, please do use the chat. We know that this is often a vibrant area of discussion as well. And do think as you're going along for the questions that you might want to ask the panelists. We have a moderator in your midst who's going to be collating some of those questions for us. So for those who missed at the beginning, I'm Rosie Jackson, and I'm the Director of Policy and Programmes at CDAC Network. I'll be moderating. First up, we're going to hear from two of the authors of the report, both with Internews. Rocío López is Community Engagement and Accountability Advisor of Internews Global Rooted in Trust project. She's been focusing on supporting country teams to strengthen community-driven programming and building strong networks with media and humanitarian actors to respond to misinformation during health emergencies. She's also the co-chair of the Global Risk Communication and Community Engagement Media Sub-Working Group. Wayne Sharpe is a health media specialist with Internews, also with the Rooted in Trust project. During his 30 years working in international media for development and freedom of expression, he established the Parliamentary Communications Centre at the National Democratic Institute of the Republic of Georgia, and has led Internews country programmes in Ukraine and in Cambodia, where he also worked with UNDP on elections and good governance. During the discussion section, we'll also hear from Esther Nakazzi. She's a freelance science and technology reporter with several awards to her name. Esther writes for various media outlets around the globe and is also a media trainer and blogger at Uganda SciGirl. She's the founder of Health Journalists Network in Uganda and is a champion of science journalism. Finally, and by no means least, Rachel James. Rachel's been leading on coordination of risk communication and community engagement in East and Southern Africa. She's based with UNICEF and supported by the Collective Service. As the Interagency Risk Communication and Community Engagement Coordinator, she's been focusing on strengthening coordination amongst ministries of health and partners in public health emergency responses to COVID-19, Ebola, and cholera, amongst others. She's also an active member of the Media Task Force, which has provided over 40 dialogues connecting journalists with health experts around key community concerns. So as you can see, we are joined by great expertise today. So that is enough from me for now. I'm going to turn to Wayne and Rocío, who are going to go into a bit more detail on the report itself. So I think, Rocío, over to you first, if we can put the slides up. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks so much. Christoph, could you turn to, yeah, next one. Next one. Okay, so thanks, Rosie. I'm gonna start like sharing a bit of what we heard from humanitarian actors in terms of the gaps and the challenges faced in their interaction with media and journalists during public health emergencies. Next slide. Okay, so first of all, humanitarian actors mentioned that there is a very scarce or like limited specialized capacity to report on health or complex humanitarian issues on the side of media. There's an acute need to provide training on health and other complex dynamics of the humanitarian response, so media is able to report accurately. And as such, the information provided by humanitarian and health actors they shared was not always easily understood by journalists. And this was often a source for misinformation during crises such as COVID-19 or Ebola responses. Media is not always, as some of the humanitarian and health actors shared, sufficiently trained in codes of ethics or good practices to report on certain sensitive issues that affect vulnerable communities, including which sources to use and how to verify and balance information. Next slide. Next slide, please. Great. So in terms of the lack of common collaboration and collective approaches, humanitarian and health organizations share that media is never or rarely invited to coordination platforms, and this certainly has some negative effects in their ability to connect to media and exchange information, identify common needs, and also on the side of media to understand priorities within the health response. It is also not possible to discuss the aims of the decisions taken during the health emergency, the public health measures, and when it's happening, this exchange with the media, this mainly focuses on the technical health aspect rather than all those questions that journalists have on the intentions. This ultimately limits the options for media to understand, again, those decisions taken, the why behind those decisions, the rationale for the measures given by health actors, leaving space for unanswered questions, skepticism, and increasing mistrust among these two actors. Next slide. So in terms of the different objectives, misunderstandings, and the mistrust derived from these, humanitarian and health organizations expressed their frustrations, trying to align the different processes, goals, and timelines between programmatic responses and media ways of working. For example, they talked about the emphasis and demand, continuous emphasis and demand for breaking news on the side of media, and also the fatigue that they felt with ongoing or protracted crisis, resulting certainly in significant barriers for humanitarian and health organizations to have issues placed on the agenda. They also shared how the fears of being misquoted or having certain issues covered with a sensationalist angle from the side of media also resulted in bigger efforts to control the narrative with key messages that did not always provide the full picture. So this approach ultimately allowed little space for journalists to do their work, to unpack broader issues, and to meet their mandate, affecting more and more this mistrust that we talked about before. Next slide. So in terms of limited resources, humanitarian and health organizations talked about the impossibility to respond in a timely manner to media requests, and this was often connected to the limitations in terms of human resources available. They also talked about the limited specialized capacity within organizations and the acute needs for training on how to better connect to media, not only for specialized comms teams, but also the needs to train technical staff on how to better navigate media relations and the value of having those open conversations media during health emergencies. There's still long procedures in place to get messages out without the proper leadership clearances, what makes also difficult for communication teams to engage with media and build solid relations with them. And what we observe is that all these limited resources or lack of resources also come from the fact that media relations are often considered as a side activity to core humanitarian services or public health interventions, ignoring sometimes the value that it can bring to broader and wider programming such as risk communications, SBCC, community engagement, or accountability efforts. Next slide. So in terms of adaptation of media relations also to local and minority languages or the inclusion of communities, humanitarians recognize that it was sometimes difficult translating complex humanitarian jargon or priorities into something that made sense for local media and also in languages that journalists speak. This is often because of the centralization of communication in HQ, either at the regional level or more national level, and the impossibility to adapt to all contextual needs without the presence in the area. As such, we identify also a very limited participation of communities in drafting, reviewing content, or leading media relations. And finally, and important, only few staff are normally given permission to engage with media, in some cases only expat leadership. So this certainly makes it difficult to maintain a continuity in the relationship with media and to hold contextually informed engagements with journalists. Next slide, please. So in terms of diminishing local media outlets and how they affect the work of humanitarian and health organizations. These actors mentioned that national media outlets sometimes have troubles contextualizing content due to a lack of presence in certain regions. On the other hand, local media, who may be obviously like more physically present, they face other challenges such as financial constraints or personal risks in insecure environments. So adding up to that, humanitarian staff, especially those in roles of media relations, tend to be also less present in rural or isolated areas or have fewer resources available to engage with media. So all of these different aspects result in local events going unreported and communities in these marginalized areas or vulnerable communities seeing their options to access contextual information curtailed. And finally, there is a lack of co-creation among communities, media, and humanitarian health actors. So all these humanitarian and health actors, they've increasingly started to collect community feedback and social listening data, rumor data, but they rarely share them to inform media about gaps and info needs. So they collect it to inform their own programming, and they talk with media about communities, but not necessarily on what community needs, which is an unnecessary creation of distance on what media can do to address those gaps. Next slide, please. Great. So finally, in terms of the risk, access, and political agendas, humanitarians talk about how issues impacting vulnerable communities in humanitarian settings are only covered when there is an extraordinary event, ignoring day-to-day information from these communities or the information that these communities need. Local media challenges also impede the access of journalists to these communities, like challenges such as insecure, like moving in insecure environments, or also poor communication structures make it less possible for them to access them, and having less options to serve their audiences or contribute or actually contribute more to the underrepresentation of these communities in national media. Finally, humanitarian organizations mentioned the risk faced with the exposure of vulnerable communities to journalists for interviews. And they mention quite often how this clashes with their mission to protect these communities. So they talk about any kind of leakage in data that could put people at serious risk, or how like poor interview techniques may contribute to traumatize even more participants. And they're also afraid of having sensationalist or coverage of these communities' issues, perpetuating stereotypes. So in response, humanitarian organizations and health organizations work with very calculated institutional approaches in their communication, ultimately offering very limited interaction with communities. Next slide. Now this is back to, well, not back to Rosie, but to my colleague Wayne, who will be covering the media findings. Over to you.
Thanks, Rocío. Christoph, can you go to the next slide, please? Great. Yes, so of course, we're talking about the relationship between journalists and the humanitarian worker. And trust is an issue that came up with both sides, came up with the journalists as well. I just want to say off the top that I don't think this focus on trust means that this is not a workable relationship, and that ultimately both sides, the humanitarian and the journalist side, are going after the same goal. Basically, in the case of a pandemic and responding to a health emergency like that, the goal is to save lives, and I think both sides work to do that. In fact, one of the journalists who answered this survey, a journalist in Mali, I think he summed it up well when he said, we have, meaning we, the journalists and the humanitarian sector, we have practically the same objective for the population: to inform and sensitize. So I wanted to say that at the outset, because all of these details about things, problems that each side has with each other, overall, they do not make the relationship undoable. And it's not like the media versus big tobacco. I mean, it's not a toxic relationship. It's just that there are issues, and a lot of them have to do, I must say, with trying to reach the same goal, but using different methods to get there. And there's misunderstandings about those methods in a lot of these cases. Okay, so trust, first off. Overall, yes, we notice a lack of a trusting relationship between journalists and humanitarian organization reps. Perceived that the journalists have doubtful intentions or professionalism. And this quote, I think, kind of sums up the root of the problem here. The problem, from a journalist in Sudan, the problem is humanitarians want journalists to adopt their messages, which threatens not only their objectivity, but also their ability to tell a story. Okay, so this comes down to journalists want to write the story or produce the story as they see it, and humanitarian groups want their message to be basically published or broadcast in whole cloth as written. And so that is kind of a clash of the ideologies of the both sectors, and that is what causes a lot of the stress, I'd say, between the two. However, although that was a common comment from most respondents in Brazil, as you can see here, media participants reported greater trust in international public health and humanitarian organizations during the pandemic. Of course, it helped in Brazil that they were dealing with quite a kooky government with Bolsonaro at the time. And I think everybody looked absolutely wonderful in comparison to Bolsonaro. Next slide, please, Christoph. Okay, yes, so there are differences in the codes of ethics that both groups follow. There's something very basic here that I just wanted to highlight. A lot of respondents said they sometimes aren't allowed to record their interviews with humanitarian actors. Now that's the journalist today does not rely on just taking notes with a pen and paper. And in fact, most journalists today can no longer work in just one medium. They're working in online content with video. They're working with sound, with podcasts. They're working in print. So it's just a normal thing now for a journalist to record absolutely everything he or she does. And so for the humanitarian sector to say, well, no, we don't want to be recorded. That right there, that builds a barrier that really needs to come down. You'll see the quote from Molly. It's very complicated for print journalists. It's complicated for all journalists not to be able to record. So I wanted to flag that. And then, of course, lack of time during emergency situations is an issue. Perception that journalists cannot report objectively is an issue. And perception that humanitarian agencies don't have staff available outside major centers. Absolutely a huge issue in making the relationship between both sides difficult. Can you go to the next slide, please, Christoph? Okay, bureaucracy versus deadlines. Okay, this is really coming to the nub of the issue. Journalists have to work quickly. That's the nature of news, and the actual word news. If it's something that happened too long ago, it's no longer news. So they have to work quickly to get information and get it published. And the humanitarian side, they have different priorities, and they have more levels of bureaucracy. So if a journalist wants to speak to a certain person about the pandemic, often they have to go up a couple of levels to get permission to do that. That's quite standard. I mean, even at Internews, we have to, before we speak to the media, we contact our headquarters and let them know this is the media request and give us our orders on how to proceed. So that's a bit of a tension there, because journalists need to work quickly and humanitarian organizations have their own rules and regulations to follow. So that sometimes puts both sides at a disadvantage. Now, the quote here from Brazil, I think, is interesting because they're saying that right at the beginning of the pandemic, everything was fine. They were getting information they needed from the response organizations. It was very easy. There was no problem. And then questions began to emerge from the community about, why isn't there a hospital in every city? Why didn't you get everybody a shot? Where are the vaccines, basically? Now, these aren't necessarily questions for humanitarian response organizations. Sometimes these are questions for ministries of health. But you can see that perhaps there is misdirected questions at the health organizations, and because they feel like it's not their question to answer, and they're still trying to deal with the situation just as bad, as urgently as the media is. Why are they being targeted? So sometimes we could see that there's a misdirection of questions, but it is the journalist's job to ask these questions, and it doesn't make them popular, and they know that. But this is basically what they're trained to do, and so it's just them being themselves, essentially. Can you go to the next slide, Christoph? Thank you. Okay, this is an interesting issue, and it's one that caused quite a bit of debate within our team, our research team here, when we were putting together this report. The issue of money for journalists, and I know this is a real thing, because when I was in Cambodia, basically the television stations were running on income from groups like, and I'll name some of them: WHO, UNICEF, Red Cross, et cetera, to produce programming. And of course, this is very important programming on medical science and issues like hand washing and things like that. But money does change hands in those instances, and for journalists, that's a complicating issue. So it came up a lot. A lot of journalists in a lot of the countries that we surveyed, which are developing countries, journalists need the financial support in order to do their job. So that's an interesting dynamic between the groups that are trying to get out the information and the groups that are actually reporting the information. And so there are issues of whether this should be condoned activity, and also issues about what this does to journalists, the image of journalists as being independent reporters. But this is we will talk about this a bit more later in this session. So I'll move on. Christoph, to the next slide. I'll quickly finish up here. Security and stigma. Yeah, this is interesting. A lot of journalists, I think because they are help to get to the site of the health emergency when they're reporting, that sometimes they feel like they are vulnerable, you know, in a situation where there's mass misunderstanding and hysteria. You know, journalists can be at the front line, and the journalists feel that the humanitarian organizations that are aiding them in getting to scenes should help them with their security. And that's another issue that needs to be dealt with as well, in areas where doing the actual job, the reporting job, has risks with it. And this last quote, I'll just end with this quote from Mali. When COVID appeared there, a large part of the population didn't believe it existed. They accused journalists of having received money. So there are misunderstandings in the public as well about what journalists do and how they do it. But and so we're not alone as humanitarian workers in having some misconceptions about the media. But this is something that is actually common. And with that, I think I will pass back. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much to Wayne and Rocío there, two of the authors. It was, I think, quite a group effort, but thanks so much for the detailed feedback on that. I'd like to now bring Rachel and Esther back into view as we go into a bit more of discussion of what we've heard. Rachel, I'm going to turn to you first. You've been working on the humanitarian response during the pandemic, presumably identifying as a health humanitarian actor within this discussion. What's your experience of this issue around collaboration? How has it impacted the response? How could we improve the coordination amongst these actors?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Rosie. So I think we've really seen during COVID and then during the other public health emergencies that we've seen in East and Southern Africa and in other countries, how it's so important that we have health experts be able to be connected directly with journalists. And we've seen so much misinformation during COVID-19 that it's been really important for journalists to be able to present the accurate story in an engaging way, and to have the capacity and the support to do so. And that's something that we really see as critical through the different coordination and collaboration platforms. So it really echoed to me that finding that there's a lack of common spaces that promote this sort of communication between health experts, journalists, and with the communities as well. So some of the good practices I've seen in Uganda when there was the outbreak of Ebola, there was a journalist training that UNICEF hosted in the initial stages, and that really provided information to the journalists on how they could accurately and sensitively report on Ebola, to give communities the information to protect themselves, but also to be able to make sure that communities and people particularly that were affected by Ebola were still treated sensitively. And it's really important if we're looking at doing this kind of journalist trainings that we're looking at engaging a range of journalists from different channels and platforms, but also making sure that different geographies are engaged, particularly so that we have information that's able to be shared by communities, with communities by journalists in the different minority languages at different community levels and platforms. In many cases, such as in the Uganda case, in Malawi, and during COVID-19, we've seen that a lot of WhatsApp groups have been set up with different risk communication and community engagement actors. And this is one really good way of these different actors rapidly sharing information, including the information that's coming from the community, different concerns that they're seeing, information around social listening, for example, which somebody referred to as well. So I think it would be really good for journalists to be able to also engage in these platforms. So they're seeing what these key concerns, issues are coming from the community as it goes along. They're also able to use that as an opportunity to share the concerns that they're hearing from the communities, so that other actors such as the humanitarian actors, ministries of health, etc., are also aware of what those different issues are. Finally, in East and Southern Africa, we've had media dialogues that have been organised, over 40, as you saw during the introduction, and that's been a really good way for taking the findings that we have from the community feedback and the social listening, what the key concerns are that communities are talking about, the key gaps in information that they have, sharing them with journalists on the call, and then having health experts provide accurate information to journalists. And through that process, we also enable the journalists to ask questions to the health experts and to be able to engage in that dialogue, which really enables them to be able to develop engaging but also accurate content afterwards. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Maybe linked to that, coming to Rocío next. One of the challenges regarding, this perceived reluctance of humanitarian actors to talk to journalists is that they feel they can't control the narrative. They're afraid of being misquoted, or their fear of journalists' intentions. And this has led, on occasions to media relations managed like public relations and not really leaving much space for the exchange of information. Do you have an example that you can talk about of how this impacts health and emergency response more broadly?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, like going a bit over the potential impacts that we have identified. So first of all, like journalists do not have the space to do their work properly if organizations do not engage with them on a regular basis. They cannot have access to the expertise, to ask questions, a bit on what Rachel was mentioning. But also certainly like this reduced transparency also with journalists can contribute to more fragmented reporting on the health situation. If journalists do not have like the trust in humanitarian and health organizations and health expertise, and that can translate ultimately into public skepticism, misinformation, and confusion. Also, we identify how controlling the narrative can limit the range also of perspectives and voices that can be included in the media coverage. And certainly that plays a role in how like vulnerable communities and marginalized communities also see themselves in the information provided, as media coverage may only rely on press, like official press releases or official statements, and may not always have the full pictures on how the specific emergency is affecting different groups. Ultimately also impacting the possibilities of those groups to take action on the information provided. And finally, there's an additional impact on how this can affect also the accountability, as engaging with journalists plays also a crucial role in holding individuals and organizations accountable for their actions and decisions. So if we try to control those media interactions, it becomes harder for journalists to ask critical questions, to seek clarification, or even to potentially like investigate misconduct or mismanagement in the response. So now going back to your like specific question on the examples, there's actually like some good examples that I want to share on how like opening up the dialogue with communities and with journalists can have also a more positive impact also on the relation. So for example, we found out throughout the research how in Mali and in contexts like Mali and South Sudan, where local radio is widely used and communities gather together very often to listen to the community. Also they call in live shows, and there's like a very well established like two-way communication with participatory radios. We saw how humanitarian and health organizations, UN agencies, NGOs, CSOs, they're way more like used to sharing like feedback data, social listening data, rumor data, all the insights that they gather from their communities, and they and share it with media, so they can actually address those needs directly in these live shows, and potentially also address all those impacts that we were mentioning before, and ultimately like continuously like supporting more solid relation with journalists. Now over to you.
Thanks, Rocío. Esther, I would like to bring you back in. I wanted to see from your perspective how these issues have impacted on the work of journalists and on their audiences more broadly. We've heard that humanitarian actors are sometimes guilty of imposing their narratives when covering certain issues, and how this impacts independence and trust. How do you navigate this?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the two researchers for that insightful report. I will speak a little bit about trust and about civil society and humanitarian agencies in our work. First of all, let me agree with what was found, that we have a common goal. Journalists and humanitarian organizations all want to inform the people. We do it in different ways, but we all have a common goal of informing the publics and delivering the message and making situations out there. You know, we improve we give information, and we try to help set the agenda and give people information that they need. So in doing this, however, we need trusted sources. And humanitarian organizations are some of the sources that we think give us the other voice that we need to listen to. In my media training, when I'm training journalists, I usually say that we have to have many voices speaking in the story, and the humanitarian voice is a critical voice to have in the media space, because they give us what sometimes we cannot find. Journalists, many media houses, and especially right now and during the COVID-19 pandemic, lost a lot of revenue. They did not have money to go down there and get that information, but the humanitarian organizations do have the money and they're on the ground. So I must say that sometimes they give us that information that we cannot find, and we trust what they give us. But sometimes it becomes a difficult relationship, because if they give you the information, they want you to portray it the way they've given it to you. And that causes an issue with us. We also have deadlines. In the first newsroom I worked in, even now as an international journalist, you are supposed to deliver on time. It's deadlines or you're dead. And sometimes you find that the humanitarian organizations will call on you when they want you to go there and put out whatever they want you to put out. But when you call them and you're in need of this information, sometimes they're not showing up, and that's a problem. But there are issues, I mean, like it has been explained, sometimes they also have a bureaucracy, they need to speak to the higher powers. But deadlines, or you're dead, you have to deliver the story. If you don't deliver the story, you're not earning money. There is a lot of, the fact that you want the information quickly and urgently, putting pressure on them, I think also strains the relationship sometimes, because they also have to get clearance from wherever they're working. during the pandemic in particular, we dealt a lot with misinformation and disinformation coming around and what was happening. And in that sense, you still need people to verify. They are in the communities, they hear this information, they are saying COVID-19 does not exist. The public thinks it doesn't exist. The humanitarian organizations are seeing people down there dying, and they can give you this information. The case of Tanzania was a little bit tricky because we had these, the political arm is saying something else. The humanitarian organizations are seeing what is happening, but they fear to knock heads with the politicians. So that can become a problem sometimes, and that's a challenge to the media. But by and large, we do understand each other. We love humanitarian organizations. We try and work with them pretty much most of the time. And yeah, we try to honor our deadlines and we move with that. Over to you.
Thanks, Esther. So just before we go to build out on some of these recommendations to the points that we've made, Wayne, just coming to you, what else can you tell us in terms of journalists' access to timely information and how that impacts their work?
Yeah, many of our survey respondents commented that, like Esther just mentioned, it's difficult at times, was difficult at times for them to get a spokesperson from a humanitarian organization to speak to the issue, this pandemic issue. So that relationship really needs some work. That's clear. The other issue about how it's so important for journalists to get information quickly is that this has all been made even more urgent because of social media, where fake news circulates almost immediately when a crisis occurs, and that makes a lot of sense. It's a lot faster to do fake news than real news, because fake news, you don't have to do any research. You just make it up and put it out there, and it runs wild. And like the saying is, a lie travels 10 times faster than the truth, or something to that effect. Is actually the case. So for journalists, the ability to get access to a humanitarian spokesperson immediately is so urgent. And the fact that that relationship does not go smoothly, as our respondents have told us, is a real issue that we have to address. So I'll stop there for now.
That's great. Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to move now. We do have some time for questions later on in the chat, and also just a quick word to our participants. If you do have answers to each other's questions, do please put them in, and we'll try to summarize at the end. We'll have time to put some of the questions to our speakers today. So we're going to come on now to some of the recommendations to look at how we can be better prepared, and what we can do to build a stronger information ecosystem, address some of these gaps. Rocío, why don't we come to you first? The report covers recommendations for humanitarian practitioners that build on the interviews and are rooted in trust experience. Could you mention maybe some of the ways forward to address these challenges, maybe one or two?
Yeah, sure. So I would say, obviously in the report, there's a lot of different recommendations, but I would say one of the main ones is to actually try to promote like an environment and a culture, organizational culture, where we shift a bit the perspective on media, and we do not only consider them as like loudspeakers to our key messages, or like just for visibility purposes, but we actually consider them as also relevant actors within the health response, like considering that they're key also actors within the community. They're part of the community, they're trusted by the community. A lot of times they may have access that humanitarian actors do not have to isolated groups or hard to reach areas, And they can certainly also inform us about the community's priorities, the community's information needs, and also what is circulating among their audiences. So this is something that we really need to take into consideration when we engage with them, like understanding that they're like certainly like unequal and in their response, and they need our support. And obviously understanding that there's like a long like relation of mistrust, or like maybe also mistrust in intentions, and a bit of what we discussed before, like also perceive that they have like specific agendas. We can certainly try to overcome that by building also like more regular like spaces for more regular conversations and dialogues. And while we are not gonna potentially share everything and all the information that we have, we can obviously guide them through what is important and what also the community needs to know, societies need to know, and about the health response. Otherwise, we're just gonna remain silent, and journalists are just gonna try to find the information in other places, and that does not necessarily mean that they will talk good about your organization, especially when we also consider like the reputational fears that humanitarian and health organizations have. I think like opening this dialogue to journalists can actually promote more trust and also collaboration on their side, and can also help audiences and communities ultimately trust more the intentions that health experts have in the amidst a health emergency. So I will now pass it over to you for other
Thanks, Rocío. That's great. And obviously, we are whizzing through what is a very detailed and comprehensive report, so do refer back to them, all our participants. Maybe Rachel, coming to you next to continue on what we could be doing as health and humanitarian actors, the possibilities to strengthen collaboration. So over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, I would really recommend working and establishing media task forces as a common platform. So before emergencies, but also so that they can be activated readily during an emergency, particularly during a sudden onset emergency or a public health emergency. So really having those spaces where journalists can very freely share concerns that are coming from communities, but also ask questions from health experts that are primed and ready to engage in that kind of dialogue. So looking at how those spaces can be coordinated and funded. And these are really good opportunities to be able to share aggregated community feedback and social listening. So I think Joseph was referring to making sure that we're letting the audience drive the agenda. And I think bringing those community feedback reports in, which look at community feedback and concerns coming from social media, from the journalists, from face-to-face engagements that humanitarian actors are undertaking with communities, bringing all those together and having health experts respond to what those key issues are, so that journalists can then report on them in engaging and accessible ways. So having those sort of media dialogue platforms, I would say it would be useful for journalists to be able to join WhatsApp groups with risk communication, community engagement, or public information actors, so that they have access to the most updated information, because a lot of the times that's when that community feedback or that social listening information is shared. And it also gives them the opportunity to share the stories and the broadcasts that they're developing, and share any concerns that they're hearing in real time from communities. And then finally, for humanitarian actors and ministries of health to invest in journalist training at the start of outbreaks and in an ongoing way, so that journalists are capable of responding. And I think those trainings are also an opportunity to develop WhatsApp groups amongst journalists where they can really rapidly share that information as well. Yeah, thanks so much, Rosie.
Thanks, Rachel. Esther, I guess it would be interesting to hear your reflections on those recommendations as well. But in addition to that, what recommendations would you have for journalists to address these gaps and work towards closer relationships with humanitarian and health actors so that we're better prepared?
So thank you, Rachel, for the recommendations. And I just hope the training really comes through, because we have a high turnover of journalists in many media houses around the globe, around Africa, actually. people come into the newsroom and within a minute and they're out, and they just need constant training to understand these issues. But another thing that we do in Uganda, and it's done in Kenya, in Malawi, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, we have what we call media cafes, which offer a platform for constant engagement between journalists, humanitarian actors, health experts, scientists or researchers really, and government spokespersons. So this has been going on for a long time, and it's a platform that gives us an opportunity to engage constantly, even after the cafes are done, because sometimes they're dictated by, the topics are dictated by the funding. But if we know that this person whom we have invited, the scientist, is a virologist or somebody who will tell us about Ebola when an Ebola outbreak comes into play, we already have the source. So these sort of engagements should be promoted. Journalists should also try to strive and specialize. When I usually talk about this and say I'm a science journalist, it's difficult for other people, for some of them to get it or to be with me. But we saw that in the pandemic, during the pandemic, the journalists who had covered health or who had a beat and knew that they covered this beat, they sort of had the sources, they knew what was happening. So there was quick action in the way they were delivering stories, and they were specialized. So I think one of the recommendations is to try for us journalists to specialize and be good at that one thing that you can really write well and people can trust you with it, and your editor can also trust you with it. But also for the trainings, we need to understand, there's social media, but we also need to understand how we are not promoting misinformation or how to spot this information that is false. Because it's absurd if a journalist in your position, you're seated there and you're promoting or you're sending out this information that is not true. It's just absurd. But sometimes they don't know, they haven't been given the tools to understand that this is false information, and they just keep using it or extending it to the public. So those three recommendations of us keeping in touch with the humanitarian organizations, specializing, and really training, reading, being on top of your game really will help us do a better job. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. So Wayne, coming to you, but just before we go to some of the questions from our participants, and we've talked about the challenges of media to operate independently, especially in humanitarian contexts. What recommendations would you have for media and how to ensure that they can continue operating and bringing quality information to their audiences?
Great. Yes, it's one of our recommendations actually refers to this in terms of independence and how to make sure that there is a line of separation in terms of objectivity and content. So our recommendation is that media that do rely on funding from the international development sector, and that's just the reality that in many countries they do, they should seek diverse funding sources and ensure any funding from an aid organization does not come with written or perceived agreements that would compromise the editorial impartiality of the media's news and information operations. In this instance, when we're talking about emergency health information, it's not so much of an issue of editorial objectivity, because this is very vital information, and it's a public service that media do by putting this on the air, in their websites or whatever. It's just the issue. Once the money changes hands, it makes the whole relationship complicated. So our recommendation, we don't sort of say, well, you can't do this. It's not journalistically proper. We're just saying be very careful and have very clear lines about how much input into the editorial content of your media that the or international health organization has when funding is involved. Back to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So I have the typical challenge of trying to chair and trying to read at the same time. So just bear with me. We do have quite a few questions coming in, and it's really great to see everybody also engaging in the discussion. So I think some of them have been answered also. We have a question here from Joseph Robbie. So apologies if I have said your name wrong. It's on social listening. So one is going to the ground and let people give feedback on the issues that are affecting them. Have a platform. Oh, that's a suggestion. Sorry, that's a comment. Sorry, Joseph. Let's go to Peggy Hannah's question. How can we make good use of the excellent material produced by health communicators and journalists to be used during capacity building efforts with community health workers and the health force? Perhaps, Esther, maybe I will come to you on that question first. So that's from Peggy.
Can I hear the question again?
And that's from Peggy. How can we make good use of the excellent material produced by health communicators and journalists to be used during capacity building efforts with community health workers and the health workforce?
The information that is produced by health workers and journalists? Oh, okay. Okay. I mean, the information that is produced by health workers definitely is very useful to us as journalists, especially if you need background information. So usually, if you have to understand a topic or go into a space where you have to interview sources and sometimes you have not you didn't have enough time to do thorough research. I think this information that is provided by health experts is really interesting for you to learn about and pose intelligent questions to your sources, but also to use in your background information if what they're giving you is relevant to what you're going to speak about or write about. I hope that helps, Peggy.
That's great, Esther. Thank you. Maybe I can throw the same question to Rachel. Yes, go ahead. Thanks, Esther.
Yeah, hi. I would also say the content that we've developed as part of the Media Dialogue series is something that's able to be used by health workers and by others working with communities. And all of the media dialogues are available on YouTube, so can be accessed by any actors. And then after each dialogue, we have been developing short WhatsApp excerpts, which journalists and others such as health workers could actually use to play to communities. And so these are verbatim quotes from health experts that can be played on radios, that can be used in workshops or trainings and that sort of thing. So I think that could be really easily done to be able to share with those groups. And if it's okay, I'll answer Tongai's question as well. I think this is a part where coordination amongst all the different actors, so humanitarian actors, health actors, and journalists is really critical, because we have colleagues on the call and that are hard at work and involved in fact checking. So they're looking at what is available in journalism articles, but also what's around social media. And we have the team from Viral Facts Africa who actually create content to address some of the concerns or misinformation that we're seeing coming out of the social media and out of the community feedback. So this is one way to really rapidly address these misinformation or information voids. And we've seen a coordination that we developed amongst many of the actors on this call during the identification of the Omicron variant, where we were able to very quickly and strategically answer and provide information that was accurate around Omicron directly from WHO experts. We were also able to debunk and pre-bunk misinformation that was available. And all of this was done in coordination. And I think that's something that's really critical to support as well. Over, thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. And so for anyone that missed that in the chat, Tongai's question was, how can humanitarian actors and journalists quickly fill the information gap which leads to social media spreading fake news in a pandemic outbreak? We had a question which, oh, sorry, Wayne, are you looking to come in?
just to respond to that question from Tongai. One of our recommendations in the report is that media, the editorial boards of media, have organized meetings with humanitarian organization representatives on a regular basis, and to just share ideas and make sure everybody is on the same page. And it has to be done before the actual health crisis, because once the crisis happens, everybody's in crisis mode and you can't build relationships then. So the recommendation is to just have information sharing meetings on a regular basis between the two sectors. That will help go a long way to building trust, and will also help for preparedness for the next health emergency, which we've learned through COVID-19 is super important. Okay, back to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Wayne. We have time, I think, for one more question. We were asked any tips or good examples of sharing community feedback and social listening data with media to inform gaps about needs. Anyone from the panel? Rocío, you're nodding.
Iñigo. So yeah, actually we've been working on this in our Rooted in Trust project throughout the last almost 3 years, like trying to put in contact like humanitarian organizations and media around the community needs and the social listening data from community. So how do we normally do that? We work on bulletins, media bulletins, where we incorporate like regularly all this data and also include reporting tips on how to respond to that specific misinformation, that specific rumor that we identify. Also with like fact-checked response, but a lot of times is this fact-checked response that also talks to local reality. So we don't provide like journalists only with maybe WHO sources and or global agencies kind of information, but also with information that talks to the reality, that comes also from local experts. So that's one way, like through regular like information products. Then we also have had like also regular cafes, a bit what Rachel and Esther were also sharing, discussing all the social listening data findings. And also discussing them through WhatsApp groups. So there's like also a peer-to-peer conversation among the journalists and together with the health experts on those gaps identified in the community feedback data, social listening data, or in the misinformation identified. Hope I responded, but if there's anything else, maybe Wayne or Rachel that can yeah, say more about just.
I'm good.
Nope, nothing. So I think those are the questions that came up. I'm not sure, maybe we do have maybe just a minute for any final words from any of our panelists. If anyone wants to sort of wrap up.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think that we like the report really points out, we need to really collaborate as journalists and humanitarian workers and work together, because like they said, we do have a common goal. Sometimes that is, misunderstood because of the many things that happen in the field, but I just have this feeling that that, you know, sometimes journalists think the humanitarian organization workers are out to get them, and you know, but by and large, we do need the humanitarian workers. And I think if we create this solid relationship with them, we can produce better stories. And we do produce better stories when we talk to them and they give us information, and we network with them continuously. So it's a good thing. And the reports, such reports should be shared widely, and more research should be done in this context. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I think that was a really useful wrap up. So perhaps I don't really need to. I think it's been super interesting. I am a visitor to this space, and I'm really grateful to have been here and to be able to witness this conversation. The report is really interesting. I would certainly recommend giving it a good, thorough read. We've heard today the sort of general gist, but it really does dig into some of these areas where we could be working more closely together, and very practical solutions to working on trust and better collaboration at the country level and regional level, obviously, as well. Things that we could be doing from WhatsApp groups and different ways of collaborating to some of the more operational ways forward. And ultimately, just as Esther has summarized there, I think the incentive is really clear. And so the deeper we can unpack this, the better. So just leaves for me to say a few things. The report is published already. It is available. Somebody asked, will we be sharing the slides? And I believe that the slides will be shared. So just from me, many thanks to all of the panelists and speakers who have given up their time today, and thanks to Internews for inviting CDAC to steer this conversation, and thanks to participants for giving us your time. I think that we might share a slide with some of the details as you're exiting, details of contacts and details of where you can find the report itself. So perhaps, Christoph, you can share that. And thanks very much to everyone.
Thank
you so much, Rosie. Thanks, colleagues.
Everyone.
Thank you.